So we know that we want the messenger's voice to fit the message. And this is something that we need to pay attention to when we first start calling, especially. But it can be kind of hard to find a way to listen to yourself when you first start calling. So we've come up with kind of 5 areas to focus on. And helpfully, we've named them the 5 Ps. So 5 words that begin with P. The first of those is pace. So when you first start calling, it's really, really important to pay attention to your pace. We don't want to be speaking too fast or too slow. I'll tell you now, it's much more likely that you would speak too fast. So that's definitely something to pay attention to. In terms of our pace, we also want to pay attention to the other person's pace a little bit. If I'm speaking to a supporter and they're speaking quite slowly, I might need to slow down, even if I wasn't necessarily going all that fast. So pace is very, very important here. This is also going to feed into other kind of key areas, key things with regards to tone of voice. If you're speaking very, very quickly, odds are you won't have very good control of your voice, and that can lead you to other problems. So the next P that we're going to talk about is pitch. Now this is an area that was covered extensively in the video that I just had you watch. So we've heard a few different examples of pitch and how that can affect our tone of voice. We heard examples, like the example with Margaret Thatcher, who needed to work on her voice to sound more authoritative. For sure, in the example of Margaret Thatcher, there's some sexism at play as well, but a lot of us can learn from that, can learn that we need to really be in control of our voice in order to sound authoritative. So definitely something to be thinking about with regards to your pitch. Is your voice comfortable? Are you in control of your voice? That's key. Some other examples we can pull from the video I just shared. The speaker that we just saw speaks quite a bit about this phenomenon called upspeak, where we have a lot of little questions at the end of sentences. This is something that can come up for a lot of our fundraisers. You might not naturally do that in your day-to-day life, but it can still show up, especially if you are reading a script. So it's something we really want to pay attention to. Also with pitch, she gives a wonderful example, this wonderful image of the prismatic voice. So we want to think about our audience, and we want to make sure that we're sort of highlighting the appropriate parts of our personality for that audience. I think this is something that's really key. We don't ever want to be fake over the phone, but we obviously need to limit ourselves to what's appropriate for the situation. If you think about people in your life, you're probably not exactly the same with everybody that you care about. I know I am close with my grandmother, and also my best friend, but I don't speak to them in exactly the same way. So definitely we want to be conscious of what our voice should be sort of conveying when we're thinking about pitch. It's important here to think too about the type of campaign that you're on. If I'm sharing happy news, maybe a huge breakthrough in cancer research, that's going to require a different tone of voice than if I'm talking about really dire medical crisis in a conflict zone. So that's something to pay attention to. The next P that we have is pause. There are places in conversation where it's natural to pause. If I ask a question, I should wait for an answer. If I'm pausing for a little bit of emphasis, that could be pretty natural too. In a normal conversation, a pause will signal to the person I'm speaking with that it's their turn to talk. So if I'm using pauses in a natural way, it can add a lot to my conversation. But the flip side of that is that if I'm pausing in weird places, it can take away from the conversation. It can take away from the flow. I don't want to pause in the middle of an idea or have a really long pause after they've asked me a question. It can be important to think about where you're going to place pauses. Sometimes if you're, making a call, especially if you're on a campaign at the very beginning of the campaign is your first call, we just sort of throw out a wall of words at this other person. And that's not very dynamic. It's not going to have a natural feel to it. We want to think about where we're going to pause in that conversation before we go in. Our next P is power. So power in this situation, I'm really talking about tone of voice. And so what I'm really talking about when it comes to power is 2 things. I want to be authoritative. I want to convey authority with my tone of voice. And I also really want to have urgency to what I'm saying. when we're calling on behalf of these charitable organizations, we want our supporters to really understand that their support is urgent. Um, it's not just something that would be good or sort of helpful in a general way, but it's something that really has power now. So we want to make sure in our tone of voice to convey authority and urgency. Our final P is pronunciation. And this one might seem a little bit more obvious. We know that we want to be clear when we're speaking on the phone. So definitely we want to enunciate. But beyond that too, we need to pay attention to pronunciation in a few key places. If you've ever worked on the phone before, I'm sure you're already very familiar with one of these. Right at the beginning of a call, you will have to say someone's name. And sometimes that will be really easy, but other times you probably will not know how to pronounce someone's name. So this is something we need to think about. It's not really a matter of if you mispronounce someone's name, unfortunately, but really when. So we want to make sure that we have a strategy to deal with that. When it happens that you mispronounce someone's name or you think you have, which generally you'll know, if you had no idea how to pronounce it, odds are you may have mispronounced it. Right away, we want to acknowledge that. So we can just say something like, oh, you know what, I'm so sorry, I think I made a mess of your name there. And then we want to ask for the correct pronunciation. So we can just ask, sorry, what is the correct pronunciation of your name? Make sure in that case that you're taking it down. That can be phonetically or however it will help you to remember it, and then use the correct pronunciation of their name. If you take the time to learn the correct pronunciation of someone's name, they're not likely to be offended that you didn't have it in the first place. It's much more likely that they would be offended if you continue to mispronounce their name all through the call, which is disrespectful. So we want to deal with that pretty upfront. There might be other areas in a call that could be challenging from a pronunciation perspective. Maybe there's some key terminology that we need to learn. Maybe there's a region of the world that we're talking about and we need to make sure that we have the correct pronunciation. Definitely, if you aren't sure how to pronounce something essential to your script, please double check that with somebody in management. We're so happy to help with that. But definitely you want to be clear on that before you go on the phone. Beyond that, I will say too that sometimes in a script there will be a certain sentence or an idea that's expressed in a certain way, and for whatever reason it just reads like a little bit of a tongue twister for you. If that's the case, I would say change it. You can rewrite it a little bit so that it flows a bit better for you. We can't change key terminology, but lots of other things we can adjust. So don't give yourself a crazy challenge every time. Just make it something more doable for yourself.